And early on, we didn't have data sets to support this. So it was really just slowly building relationships. So then fast forward to 2017, I mentioned we had a Sunnybrook engagement. So they said, yeah, if you bring us breast milk, we'll do these extractions. So I had to get milk. Now,
Okay, we have Viraj here from Lactiga. Viraj, thanks for joining us.
great to be with you, Ravi.
Did I get that right, Lactiga?
Lactiga, yeah. I mean, it's a
Lactiga.
made-up word, so there's not like really a correct way to say it. It's just whatever we want to do.
No, startup names are so interesting. They always follow a convention of being different, right? It's
That's
kind of the
right.
kind of the thing. So where are we finding you? Where are you calling from?
Also in Toronto,
Perfect.
just close
Also
to
in Toronto.
downtown.
I love this because, man, your company really stands out. I was reading the bio, and it really drew me in. Did a little bit of a deep dive, of what you're doing. So, using human breast milk to convert to solve autoimmune deficiencies and issues, really interesting. I'm really interested in this field and learning more about it. So, I'm really intrigued to dive deeper into this with you. So, to start, I mean, how did you get into this field? What's your past look like?
Yeah, great question. I think for many of us founders, like we're focused on the technology, but it came from a human story or a personal story, and
Mm-hmm.
that's definitely true for me. So I'm a dad, and my daughter was born about 8 years ago, and like most parents, at some point, the mom is pumping, and sometimes it's late night pumps, and you don't use it all, so it starts stacking up in your freezer, like just pouch on top of pouch. But unlike most dads, I'm also a very nerdy scientist. So I would see these pouches and I was like, well, we all know there's a lot of nutritional value locked inside these pouches. But as someone with genetics, immunology, virology, molecular bio background, I looked a little deeper. I was like, well, these things are also chock full of antibodies, which are the molecules we naturally produce to keep ourselves healthy. If we're immune competent. There's this whole range of immunodeficient or immunocompromised people. We'll talk about who those are, that
Mm-hmm.
they actually don't make enough antibodies. And just as you'd expect, they get sick way more often. So, way back then, I used to see all these pouches, and it was just sort of, well, if we have extra, probably a lot of families with breastfeeding babies have extra. And if there is actually extra all over the world, like what happens to that? Do they just toss it out if they don't need it? And if they don't toss it out and it's available, what if you could extract the thing we care about, which is antibodies? You don't really need the rest. And what if you could position that as a brand new therapy? And because milk is obviously meant to go down the throat and into the stomach, I mean, it's stable. Those antibodies are stable in that environment, even though there's acids and proteases all around your stomach environment. So I thought, well, that's something pretty interesting about breast milk. And, the research literature already knows this, but it hasn't been put into a clinical product, not that I could see. So I said, what would be the smallest amount of studies to at least prove to myself that maybe this is worth pursuing? And that brought us to Sunnybrook Institution here, brought us to Sick Kids. And these are investigators and institutions I knew just because of my business development work around the GTA. So I started reaching out and I said, there's just this idea in the back of my head. I have nothing yet, but if I did these small studies, could you do this part? And like, could you help me with that? What might that cost? What might that look like? And that's really how we started. That was about 4 years now.
Wow. No, I love this a lot because I nerd out about immunology as well.
Oh, perfect.
Just because I've always been like when I was a kid, I was sick all the time, right? I
Okay.
had to get over asthma. I had to like I had to deal with all these issues that it just seemed like things that compiled against me. And I started looking into this, right? And I have a neuroscience background myself, and most of it came from this obsession with understanding the body and the mind and how everything works, and like why we make the decisions we do, why we do things we do. And one of the things that really shook me, really, is to learn that like in the human body, 1 in 3 cells, up to 1 in 3 cells, is not our own. It doesn't share our genetic history, right? So our body mass, 1 in 3, 1/3 of us, is other organisms that live kind of in a symbiotic relationship with us, right? And it's like we are like a farm almost, and there's a whole bunch of things we like breed within us that kind of build their own ecosystem, and we benefit from that ecosystem. And a lot of our industrialized processes and industrialized things kind of disrupt that thing, disrupt that ecosystem a lot, right? So I'm really interested in this kind of framework of thinking of like us being a vessel, being more than just like us is actually compartmentalized, right, into so many different parts. And looking at things from this kind of lens, we kind of adopt a new worldview on how health should look like, right? We're not just taking care of ourselves, but the ecosystem that we live in and things that interact with us. Does that does that blow your mind, or does that take up a lot of your mind space? Do you think about that a lot as well? Because that blows my mind thinking about things like that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what a fascinating concept. We'll definitely get into it. And by the way, thanks for sharing your personal connection to, immune disorders. I mean, as much as we really have to focus on different aspects of the technology and the business, for me, it's like, well, if this isn't going to wind up in a patient's hands or in their home in some way, like that's the only goal here, right? Everything has to lead to that. So I try to remind myself, like, the patient is the focus. Everything should be leading towards that. And then your point about we are a vessel full of all kinds of stuff. Some of it is our own cells and our own growth process, and then there's everything else. You can think of homeostasis or maintenance of the gut biome. These are some of the phrases that have become very popular in these last couple of years. And it's such a perfect example of what we're thinking about, because the crisis of antibiotic resistance, which has been in the news for years and years, but it's sort of recognized as this clear and present danger from the medical community, that if we keep using antibiotics, the tiny percentage of bacteria that escape and can still survive despite those antibiotics now are superbugs or superbacteria, because they've already outgrown that particular antibiotic. So what happens? You don't use that as much. You go to your next level, which was like, well, these are our reserve antibiotics. We were hoping to not need these. But what happens? Well, now we need them because the bacteria have outgrown the first line defenses. And that's an arms race, and it's going to keep going. So what's more likely to happen? Humans run out of antibiotics first, or bacteria keep mutating and growing? Well, they're going to keep mutating and growing because that's what they do. So we are going to run out of antibiotics way before we hit that critical mass. And so one piece of what we're doing is restoring the components that healthy people produce to actually try to restore that balance in the gut, just like you were saying. So you can keep certain pathogenic species in check. The fact that some of them persist and grow is actually good for us. There is that synergy, as you said. But when it comes to the pathogenic ones, you do need to control those. Now, these milk-derived antibodies are perfect for that situation because they are raised in the milk of lactating mothers who are responding to all the viruses, bacteria, fungi, and parasites that they're encountering in their environment. So the ones that could cause illness are the ones that antibodies are produced against. And then for harvesting those, providing those to patients, we're providing that protection to them.
Yeah, I love that. I think that one of the key distinctions to understand the difference between like, antibiotics and antivirals, and like the idea of like boosting your immune system versus something that's like replacing it. Like modern medicine is almost like, cool, these are our solutions for these problems, and it's like it comes in with carpet bombings and just flatten the playing field. I'm like, okay, now we're walking away. And the problem is, after we've flattened this forest, the first thing that comes back up is weeds, right? So the problem with like autoimmune diseases is that it's that when your immune system is suppressed or turned against you, the problem is that it's the things that everyday things becomes an issue about this, right? So people experiencing chemo understand this, where it's like, oh, now you're more susceptible to like everyday bugs when your immune system is compromised and brought down. Can we first just take a moment to talk about autoimmunity, autoimmune diseases, and autoimmune issues? There are different types, and like, can you establish what that is for us first, and then we can talk more about how we're solving it?
Yeah, yeah, such an important point. And I'll draw a distinction as, an immunology nerd who spent a couple years at the FDA really digging into topics around immunology. So there's autoimmune disorders, which is actually different than what we're talking about. That's when aspects of your body are basically attacking themselves. And so that you're creating reactivity against something that's not foreign. It's supposed to be normal and healthy. So that's autoimmunity. What we're focused on is something quite different, which is immune deficiencies. And so they make too little of something that could have protected you against foreign invasions. So there's this very large category called primary immunodeficiencies. That's a bucket category. It actually includes over 350 diseases. Now, of those 350, some of those patients are totally normal except that they're missing one thing. And in many of those cases, the one thing they're missing is a type of antibody. And an even particular subset, the thing they're missing is the types of antibodies that happens to be naturally abundant in human breast milk. So that's a slam dunk for us in terms of mechanism of action. Because if the only thing wrong with them is that they don't produce enough of these antibodies called IgA antibodies, And that's the second half of our company name, by the way. Lact, and then IGA, so Lactiga. That's kind of
Yeah.
that's an Easter egg shout out for all the nerds who can who can put the two parts of the name together. But IgA antibodies are missing in these particular patients who have an IgA deficiency, and human milk or breast milk is chock full of that exact type. So that's great for us because we can say, well, these are naturally occurring. They're already in high concentration. If we can extract them, press it into, let's say, a tablet or a pill or some other easy oral formulation, you can get that right into the gut compartment so that the thing that's missing has now been introduced.
So speaking nerd to nerd, can we compartmentalize that a little further, like downwards? Like, what is IgA and what particular what does it do for us?
Yeah, great question. I didn't know we'd be doing a nerd deep dive, but like I'm always ready for that. I'm always
Let's do
waiting
it.
for people to ask for that. So good,
Yeah.
good for you. But so we as humans make 5 different antibody subtypes: IgA, and then there's IgM, IgG, etc. The one we're most interested in is IgA because it's, as I said, it's the one that's already naturally abundant in human milk or breast milk. Now that IgA is very distinct compared to all those other ones. Number one, it's produced primarily in mucosal spaces. By mucosal spaces, I mean the sinuses, airways, and the lungs, and then the gastrointestinal tract. And the inner linings are, kind of slimy and mucousy. That's why they're called mucosal compartments. IgA is the predominant subtype in those compartments. If you think of traditional antibody biologics that the pharma industry makes billions of dollars off of, those are typically IgG antibodies, which is the type that is predominant in the blood. So we're actually creating antibody therapeutics, but they are really significantly differentiated and they don't behave the same way as these serum-derived IgG antibodies. That's really good for us because the product we're developing can do things that those other existing monoclonal antibody therapeutics cannot do. Specifically, we're talking about the kind that's already stable in the gut. And like I said, it's very acidic, it's protease rich. So most stuff you throw down there, it's going to be digested and destroyed. We're talking about the only antibody subtype that's naturally resistant to the effects of those acids and proteases. So it's perfect. We're leveraging the fact that they already have these naturally bioavailable and biostable properties, unlike other antibody types that are out there. So we're
That's
sort of
so
using
cool.
nature as a competitive moat.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, definitely using what works and what's already available. I love this.
And also,
Just to,
it's
yeah,
like staying on the nerd topic, like you have to engineer these and you have to, refine these and purify them. But the more manipulations and the more additives you put into this mixture, I mean, you're changing the costs, you're potentially compromising the activity of what you started with. Our approach is, why would we do that? Let's leverage the properties that are already there, that we won't require extra additives and manipulations.
definitely, and that puts people at ease too, right? It's less manufactured, less of a foreign substance entering your body, and more something that's already there. You're magnifying, or anything that you already have had exposure to. Breast milk is something that most of us have come in contact with, right? And so going back to this, right? Like um, um, IgA and what it does for us. Like I like that idea. Like, you mentioned that this mucus component, right? It goes into the sinuses and it goes to the mucosal layers, right? Like lately, like it's come almost fashion to talk about inflammation, right? It's almost like a fad. People don't know really what it is, but inflammation being the cause of a lot of our issues. We talk about reducing inflammation as one of the key components of active body health. And then we have like advocates of like alkaline water and all these things, demucify yourself, reduce inflammation. There's so many different things going around about inflammation, right? Like, um, does this idea like play in that kind of environment of inflammation, reducing inflammation? Is there a component there? Like, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Wow, we're really going deep on the nerd stuff. I love this. But so if we think about the infections that are commonly happening in the gut environment, which is the infections we're trying to prevent, well, what is actually happening? Some type of pathogen, whether virus, bacteria, fungi, parasite, etc., has gotten into the gut and is starting to replicate. And it's replicating it more and more, and that growth becomes exponential. So now there's a lot of whatever there was, and many of them actually secrete toxins as well. So the bacteria can secrete bacterial toxins. So not only are the bacteria growing, but they're literally depositing toxins into your gut compartment. And both of those processes can drive some of the inflammation that you're talking about. So while our product is not specifically an anti-inflammatory product in the way that some of these pharmaceutical products are, marketed, it does still have it should have beneficial effects because it is cleaning up the infection. And if you're removing the bacteria, then you're removing the source of those toxins that were causing inflammation and other immune responses. So a phrase I used before is restoring homeostasis or restoring balance to the gut microbiome. And inflammation is definitely a component of restoring that balance, is getting it back into check.
Hmm. Yeah, so the biome part is it's something that it's really spectacular, right? Because currently, I believe like the best way of restoring gut biome is excrement, right? Like you take like a pill of someone's healthy guts, someone with a healthy guts poop, right? And I think it's the
Fecal transplant.
Hopkins Hopkins John Hopkins in the States, the hospital slash hospital co-invented this, and it actually like pays people in the area to donate,
Yeah,
and collects healthy gut biome through like a pill of poop, and that's how it gets restored. All right, like that's currently the environment we live in, and like we live in an age of lasers, but we have to ingest excrement in order to like restore our gut, and that shows kind of like how behind we are in this level of science and thinking, right? Previous like we think about like the older kind of types of health, right? Like the pre-scientific thinkings, and we think about,
yeah,
oh, you must like take care of yourself. You had to, it focuses on a lot of homeopathic aspects, and science kind of for 100 years wrote us off as like witchcraft. It's like, no, this doesn't
absolutely.
make any sense. We have to be regulars, and now we're kind of relearning this kind of aspect of ourselves, that we live in like a larger context, right? We're interconnected to other things that have impacts on us, and I think it's really interesting that we're now, now be able to manipulate that too at that level.
I'm so glad you mentioned this because I feel like it's more of a philosophy question than a medical technologies question. You made this point actually a few minutes ago. You said when you give, especially strong antibiotics, you're kind of carpet bombing the gut and you're hoping that the correct things will make it back and whatever was making you sick is now dead. I mean, you're kind of hoping. And you're sort of using this, bomb strategy to achieve that. And that's, these are antibiotics. There, some of them are naturally derived and others are chemically synthesized. So it's quite an artificial approach. And that has been kind of the interventional approach of, I think, Western medicine, just as a very general statement. Whereas, you know, East Asian principles of Ayurvedic medicine and some of these other concepts, my understanding from the beginning was they're much more about holistic attitudes towards the body, not as discrete compartments that sort of each is like a piece of an engine that just does one thing, but there's actually a larger functioning unit. And supporting, let's say, the gut might have benefits to mental health. Well, traditional Western medicine, you probably wouldn't make that connection because they seem so different, so you might not try it. But with non-Western approaches, I think there's much more willingness to take that kind of attitude. And I don't pretend to know that world very well, but I would say that our approach really is about restoring balance and sort of a nuanced way rather than saying, here's a specific bomb or weapon and this is supposed to neutralize everything. Rather than that
Mm.
approach, this is like, well, it's about restoring the balance that could have been there if these patients were producing antibodies the way they normally do. And those antibodies are direct reflections of the environment that the people are exposed to, because you only make antibodies against pathogens you were exposed to. So there is kind of a nuance and a back and forth. It's not like an antibiotic, which is where you just sort of introduce it and it blows everything out of the water. That's a very different, that's not a balance. That's just sort of like a weapon.
So I love that you brought this up. There's something I want to run by you, right? Like especially now we're down this topic of like things that can disrupt us and things we live with. There is a particular type of brain parasite. It's a type of class called peons or prions, right?
Prions, yeah.
Prions, right? And we've just recently discovered these things exist. There's one in particular that really stands out called taxoplasma, right? Taxo something, and it's a parasite that has a life cycle normally with rats and sorry, mice and cats, right? So they reproduce and live in this ecosystem where they can only reproduce in the cats and in the gut of a cat, right? And it gets excreted. They what they do is they create a certain their babies come out in the cat's urine, but it flavors the urine. Sorry. So what happens? No, sorry. Let me take this back. It comes out of the cat's excrement, infects mice, and then turns in the mice it makes them sexually attracted to the smell of cat urine, so that it also depresses their fear reflex, right, and makes mice more likely to like follow a cat and therefore get eaten. So therefore the toxoplasma that's in the mice can reproduce in the cat, and the cycle starts again, right? So this is like almost like an unsentient like system, right? That's like helping cats. It doesn't affect cats at all, right? But it brings like food to it, keeping it alive, right? Like a ethereal monster that's like helping it, right? By retraining, by reprogramming rats, and then uses in return uses the cat to reproduce.
Yeah.
But in humans, so humans who grow up with cats are likely to get this. Toxoplasma, if it gets in, it resides in the brain, excretes a type of protein that makes you more likely to take risks. And in fact, it's shown that majority of entrepreneurs have this bacteria in their brain, making them more risk-taking, right?
Amazing.
And one of the highest concentrations of people who have this prion is in France, which originated the word entrepreneur,
Wow.
right? And this fact, like I don't know what to do with this idea or
Yeah.
this thought, right? Like it's like it comes back down to like who are we and who's making the decisions, right? Like in neuroscience, we're trying to like the hard problem in science is trying to figure out what consciousness is, right? Where does it reside? We science, we think it's in the brain, but we haven't actually found the compartment layer that operates that consciousness, right? And I started looking at humanity as like a sense of layers that operates. There's a neocortex layer that operates that's us, right? There's a subconscious layer that's the hormones that releases all the hormones that controls the hormonal productions, and that's reliant on our emotions and our emotional staking and very unconscious behaviors, right? Through the mammalian cortex. Then there's the spinal cord. Then there's this gut biome, right? That interacts with us. Oftentimes the things we crave when we crave food, it's not us who actually crave it. It's like there's about 1/3 of the type of amount of cell neurons in the brain is in the gut, transacting with the gut biome there, and the and as bacteria get hungry, they excrete these hormones that trigger these neurons to go to your subconscious and be like, hey, I want a cookie. You know, I want that Tim Hortons like tea, right? Like when we crave things, it's a gut that is sending a signal that's making you remember something that makes you crave that thing, and then now you're manipulating the environment around you, using your capability as a human to go and get this thing for the bacteria that does benefit you in the end somehow, right? But you're being triggered. So who controls who? What is this vessel that we're housed in, right? How is it actually run? Because there seems to be a multiple of systems like fighting for collective behavior.
Another big philosophy question. I love this. And that toxoplasma example, I mean, nature is so bizarre and crazy. I love it. I just sort of recently remembered to just watch like National Geographic. I think earlier today it was like a clip on ants devouring a slug. It's just so many crazy stories out there. But to your point, yeah, I mean, I guess philosophically you can make an argument that we're this like large, mobile and cognizant sack of muscle that does what colonies of bacteria think are good for them. I guess maybe a comedian could make a good argument for that.
Yeah. As you said that, there was actually a movie back in the late 90s, early 2000s. I think Bill Murray acted in it. It was like this zookeeper who was super filthy, right? And it was told the perspective was from white blood cells that lived in his body that had to fight off all the stuff that he kept ingesting into him,
That is
right?
funny.
And it personified the types of systems in the body, and how it has to interact, with the outside world through this human layer, right? And it talks about like levers in the brain, like how the different systems hack levers to recontrol him, to push him away from. Oh, I almost lost you for a second. Can you see me?
Yeah, I see you. We're back.
Yeah.
That's really funny. And actually, to try to bring it back to the point you were making about like different systems and systems of complexity, and like the fact that we're talking about the origins of the word entrepreneur. If I could pick one thing, I think I'm maybe like a little bit better than average at is like just appreciate there's going to be complexity.
Mm.
There's a challenge you want to address as an entrepreneur. And like, oh, if I could do this one thing, I could solve that one thing. Okay, but that's way too simplified, right?
Yeah.
So for me, it's like as soon as a question comes up, I'm sort of thinking of other questions because like I know there's complexity. So let's whoever I'm having the conversation with, let's acknowledge there's going to be more nuance and complexity than we thought, even if we started with a very simplified question. And for me, it's like the challenge is let's just dig in. Let's just get our hands dirty and say, you didn't satisfy me on this part, so we need to dig deeper. And guess what? When we talk about that deeper topic, one of us is probably going to realize another branch off of that. So now that created another layer of depth. To me, I mean, if you're not thinking that way in terms of growing your business, you're going to get stuck because everyone can like form a simple hypothesis. As a scientist, that's the first thing you do. Form the most simplified hypothesis that you can test it because all the other variables you've controlled or you've excluded them from the experiment. That's good. That's an important framework. But in the real world, especially in the health technologies world, there's patients, they have economic needs, personal needs, there's medical complications. So that if that's the reality for them, how could you ignore that, right? You have to acknowledge that, you have to respect that, and build those complexities into your solution. That's been
Yeah.
my approach.
Yeah, so let's go back to that. You originated the story with like you had the supply of breast milk that that you had. Like, how did that turn into a company? How did that turn to a startup?
Yeah, I'm gonna share some very awkward. Early founders do things that don't scale just so you can kind of prove a concept. So I'm gonna make that very real for you. So as I said, I sort of just took this thought process like, well, if we have some milk and like other moms I've spoken to are in the same boat, so there must be this stuff in the world. How might you access that? And I started learning about milk banks. So everyone has heard of blood banks, but not many people have heard of milk banks. Just to give you a few stats in bullet form, there's over 700 milk banks around the world, about 32 in North America, about 4 of those are in Canada. And the purpose of milk banks, you can probably guess from the title, is they actually procure that extra milk from all those moms that produce that extra. Now, obviously, the preference in terms of all health and public health agencies prefer and encourage moms to breastfeed their own child. I mean, that's basically the gold standard for neonatal health. And if they're achieving that, but these moms still have a bunch of extra and it's still stacking up in the freezer, well, that's great. That's a resource that's now available. And that's what the milk banks can access. So I was learning about that process and I started just doing cold outreach to executive directors of milk banks just to say like, hey, I'm slowly starting to put together this vision. The beneficiaries would be these patients, but you as a milk bank director could play this role if we had some kind of supply framework. And early on, we didn't have data sets to support this. So it was really just slowly building relationships. So then fast forward to 2017, I mentioned we had a Sunnybrook engagement. So they said, yeah, if you bring us breast milk, we'll do these extractions. So I had to get milk. Now, I was many years past the birth of my daughter, so we didn't have any of that milk available. So I started just asking people in the GTA who happened to have some immunology background, like, here's this concept. If I had milk, like I would do these studies and I could build out this proof of concept. And like the first 2 people I asked, amazingly, were like, "Oh, my best friend just had a baby. Like, let me ask her. She probably has extra." So
Wow.
these Toronto moms wound up being cool with that.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember like where I was in my life at the time, but I don't think I even had a car. So, and it was like too far to like TTC. So I like rented a zip car to drive to a lady's house that I'd never met because remember, this is a friend of a friend.
Hmm.
So I'm knocking on the door and she opens the door and I'm like, oh, hey, I'm the guy that's here to get milk. Like, I'm really sorry. Is that okay? And I felt so awkward, but
Yeah.
like you had to do it. That's the thing that doesn't scale.
Yeah.
And they were so cool with it. I think in one case, it was actually the dad, the husband. And he's like, can I help you? And I was like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm here for your wife's breast milk. And he's like, oh, yeah, no, it's fine. It's fine. She kept it aside. Let me go grab it. And I love it because there's these super awkward stories.
Yeah.
But it's what got me the early samples that I brought to Sunnybrook. So we did the extractions. We proved we could get these antibodies. And that's kind of what it took.
That's really interesting because like you don't see these you don't see those stories, right? Like
Exactly.
when you see like the front page article come out and like look at this invention that came out, like look at this innovation, behind the scenes stories, right? That's so interesting. So
Exactly.
you're at Sunnybrook, you got access, you procured access to this supply chain. What happens next? How did that turn into like IGA?
Yeah, yeah. So then it became more of like an iterative scientific discovery process. I did the awkward milk pickups, brought it to Sunnybrook, and I really just designed out experiments that were based on, okay, well, in the world of blood extractions, and blood antibody extractions have been done for many decades. That's a different clinical product.
Mm-hmm.
But since it's out there, I said, well, let's start from that. How could we modify that? How could we create novel intellectual property to protect what we're trying to do, and try to create a competitive moat against existing companies that are experts in blood and could potentially just like outcopy or outperform our procedures. So the goal was to say, what modifications is it going to take to process milk instead of blood, and like, can we be the ones to own those modifications and those processes? And so that's what we did with the protein lab at Sunnybrook, which is to say, this is how it's done in blood. Let's test these modifications. If this allows it to work in milk, then hey, I think we're onto something. And that's kind of how that went. So we went to Sunnybrook for that work. We actually worked with another Toronto startup called VivaVax, and they're also in the biotechnology space, because we wanted to characterize this extracted IgA that we had gotten. And then I leveraged this great researcher at St. Kitts Hospital, who I had a working history from my previous biz dev role. And I said, you're in pediatric respirology and virology. I had this thing that could work in the gut and the lungs. Could we do some early testing in your lab? Because I know you've done studies that could help us answer this question. He was more than happy to do it. And so we actually leveraged 3 different Toronto area research institutions to generate our patent enabling data sets. And it was really leveraging connections I had made both professionally and personally over the many years that I had lived in Toronto. So power of network. I think most entrepreneurs know that, but if you're not keeping your relationships and friendships warm, like, you're really missing out.
No, I 100% agree. Like it's one of the most underrated things that we fail to teach people, is that hey, you are who you know, right? Like your knowledge base is not just your own. I mean, talking about the network effects, of our biome and how different things are interrelated. We are in an ecosystem, right? And people we know are part of that. So I love thinking about it that way. So cool. You did this research, you got this support. Um, to make this into a company. Are you an entrepreneur? Are you a serial entrepreneur? Have you done this before? What would that look like?
This is definitely the first time taking it as far as what we've done.
Mm-hmm.
And the short version is we actually have some venture funding. I'm really excited about that. We've closed about half of our seed fundraising target.
Amazing.
Really had to learn all the ins and outs of company formation, and then how do you structure a round. Like a seed round is totally different than a Series A. So what are the differences? How do you negotiate with investors who do this for a living? Like, they could outshark you, in their sleep. So like, all these thoughts are in my mind. And by the way, I've taken 0 finance or business related courses in my entire life. I mean, it sounds like you have a business background, but you also do neuroscience. But for me, I was sort of like straight bio and genetics and molecular bio the whole time. So there was 0 part of my curriculum that covered any of this stuff. So it's really just being self-taught for some of those things, like the company building aspect. I knew from the get-go, if you can create a patent, that's amazing. In the biotech space, that's kind of table stakes to be a very serious early biotech. Get some intellectual property, get some good data, but that's less than half the story. If you're not describing the vision, all these cheesy words like total addressable market. I mean, so these sort of common jargons that are used in the business community. I mean, I sort of recognized at one point, I can't avoid answering those. If I don't understand the business fundamentals, no one's going to take me seriously. So how can I start building those out? And luckily, I think the current generation of entrepreneurs is much luckier in a way than someone like at my age or older, because everyone these days grew up with like cell phones and Google. Like, that's just a normal resource that didn't exist when I was, finishing up undergrad. So the ability to just learn about finance terms and then like pull up the market data that actually supported our use case for these very specific niches of immunodeficient patients, every piece of research I've ever done has been free. I didn't have to like go to libraries and access the Dewey Decimal System. I mean, like, that just doesn't happen anymore. So the ability to access things instantaneously was such a game changer. And it's just, being smart about, are these credible sources? Are they consistent with other credible sources I've seen? If you can do that, I mean, now you're starting to put together a story that it's very difficult for people to poke holes in.
Yeah, I love I love what you're talking about this because you're talking almost like a scientist who's building a company, and you're talking coming from a science background, it makes kind of sense. I agree with you in the challenges. This is something that I personally experienced myself, and the reason I seem to have a business background is because I have an executive MBA from three failed companies from the ages of 17 to
There you go.
25. I started my first company with only only my high school like one course in accounting in high school behind me, and spectacular failures in handling finances as being a CFO of my first company, right? And the failure of that is what sparked me, like, oh my god, I gotta go learn this stuff. I gotta go figure this out. And being on the tail end is not fun. Being able to tail end of chasing knowledge that you don't know is not fun, right? So I love the way you're thinking about it because you're almost like, okay, like any kind of science problem, you kind of develop a hypothesis, you kind of figure out what are you working with, you tally things out, and you kind of go about it, right? So one of my favorite thoughts recently that came out of the podcast was from Travis Ratnam, runs an ed tech company, and he talks about like startups are really laboratory experiments. They're not smaller version of a large company. They're laboratory experiments, and people who think as scientists or engineers do really well in this because what you're doing is running experiments, but in a systematic way, right? Including how to commercialize it. Is it can this thing be used in this kind of product? Can for this kind of market? Do we position it like this? How do we explain this aspect of it, right? Like you're testing out different things, even in the way of getting something out there, right? Can we talk a little more about that? Like, how is your framework around? Okay, cool. How do I get this to market? We've discovered this principle. How do we commercialize this now?
Oh, I love this question. So I'm gonna throw in an analogy that seems like it's out of nowhere, but I love reading about cars, like sports cars, family cars, whatever it is. Just love learning about them. I've owned some like pretty sporty cars. I've been happy about that. But the reason I bring this up is when I was really young, the really just way out there concepts. They had a name for the sort of small labs that existed like inside of GM, let's say. Those working on, like the Corvette ZR1. And the informal name was Skunk Works. And I guess that word means sort of like, it's this kind of like ragtag
Yeah.
bunch of weirdos and rebels, and they're sort of inside a corporate structure, but they don't really report up to corporate supervisors, and they have a little bit of a blank check to just try something crazy. And if it doesn't work, like they might shut down the project. But, high
Hmm.
risk, high reward. And I love that word and that concept. And honestly, I think of startups in general, but our approach as that as well. Now, we're not inside a corporation, obviously, but the point is we're kind of building the rules. We're sort of creating a playbook that if this could be sold or could be acquired, that would make sense. And we would want to engage with existing incumbent pharmaceutical companies at some point, and then we'd have more of a corporate story because you have to kind of sell it to them so it makes sense, and that's fine. But because we're not there yet, just like you said, we can just test and iterate and experience those failures. And I don't even really use the word failures in the startup world. It's just more like these are experiences. And if they were teachable moments, then that's great. That's so different from a failure, I think.
I love that
I
because
think agile, lean, like acknowledging that you're going to make mistakes and some of them won't work out. But at the same time, the next time you encounter that problem, whether this startup or some other future startup, you're probably not going to make that mistake. So you're going to seem so much more savvy the next time that set of decisions comes around.
yeah, I mean, going back to like why science or STEM-minded folks do really well in startups is because exactly what you said, right? Like failure to other people are considered to be like the end block, but in science, it's like failure is like okay, it is actually what you want, right? Like a proof of no or this doesn't work is just as valuable as a learning experience as yes, right? And you kind of it helps you kind of steer you in the right direction. It's like the step forward. If anything, science is chasing failure to failure until you map out what doesn't work, right? And when you deploy that into the kind of the startup world, it's like comes into how fast you can kind of iterate and move out and push things out. I love that kind of framework, right? Of going about as like problem-solving vehicles. That's what startups are, and what you're talking about, like a skunk works, right? Like the open innovation industry, innovators in general, like why do we have incubators? Why do you have all these support structures? Why do you have this? Is because like, the innovation industry in total, it's almost like the skunk works of our larger economy, right? It's supported
Absolutely.
by, pillared by the government, by corporate partners, by all these people who are taking bets on entrepreneurs like yourself, who can come up with these kind of companies, right? Can you talk a little bit about the support structure that's around you? Have you gone through incubation systems, accelerators? How's that look like for you?
Yeah, I always love giving shout outs to the people that have really made a difference. I mean, to me, the top of the list, and they all happen to be mostly like GTA area resources. The first is the Launch by You program from YSpace. Just an incredible job. It was a summer boot camp, and it was like the whole summer. This was last year. So it was during lockdown, they had to go fully virtual. You know, it was their first time having to do it that way. And so there was masterminds, there was entrepreneurs in residence, there was mentors, there was like business fundamentals. There was just such a wide variety of resources that they provided. And by the way, no fees, no equity taken. I mean, literally zero downside, only upside. I still think it's kind of incredible. And the mentors that I met spanned from restructuring a pitch deck using a professional graphic designer who actually tweaked a lot of our pitch graphics. Actually, our logo that's on our website and our materials is from this graphic designer. Different mentors just helped with pitch support and the narrative, because as a scientist, like, I could talk science all day, but compressing it into a really quick story that would resonate with a total non-scientist in the way I needed to, I mean, that's kind of difficult for me to do. I'm not great at that. So there were just so many versions of support that came through the Launch by You program. Mars Discovery District has been good to us. They've made some excellent connections, some challenging challenging topics, even things like the specific terms. I have this term sheet. We have a lead. I think they're interested. Like, are they going to beat me up on this term? Should I sort of like agree to it because it'll get me to the end goal, or should I push back? And just having those discussions. And in all those discussions, it has to be about you, the founder, and your company. There's not like a playbook, like just plug in these numbers and you'll be fine. That's not going to work for you, because then you haven't personalized it to your needs. So just understanding those terms and having the confidence to know that, okay, I'm going to have a discussion just on terms with these lead investors. And as a first-time founder, the first fear is, well, if I get this wrong, they're just going to say no. Or if I push too hard on certain terms, they're the ones with the money. They can just leave. They can like reject the deal. So it feels like a lot of pressure. But balancing that by saying you have to project confidence and you have to stick with your guns and convince them of your original evaluation. Because if you don't believe in the value of their company, why would they? So it became, like, for me, fundraising and understanding finance in general became so much about psychology and confidence, and like these soft skills really had nothing to do with a finance background or telling a scientifically, technically compelling story. It wasn't about those that much. It was just about, like, how do you convey the right amount of confidence? You don't want to be arrogant, of course. And we closed all our funding during lockdown, so it's all been on Zoom and phone calls. We didn't even have the in-person, let's get a coffee vibe that most investors have become accustomed to pre-lockdown. So, those soft skills, looking people in the eye, I mean, body language, a little bit of that shows on the screen and the rest of it doesn't. So, you ignore those soft skills at your peril.
That's really interesting. The soft skills, this fixation on soft skills development has become more and more parallel, and it's hilarious because we're in the most technological advanced age ever, and we're talking about soft skills being the main skill to have, right? Like, everyone thinks about, oh no, I need to learn to code, I need to know how to interface with AI. On one side, you're absolutely right, but at the end of the day, humans and be able to cooperations is our biggest asset, right? The ability to cooperate with other humans, and the soft skills are to communicate our values, our principles, and our vision for ultimately what we're building is super important, right? And the people that we have around us, especially the infrastructure we have, it's super important. I love the YU team, David Kwok and Nafis. Now, he does, they do an amazing job. Mick B's been on here a few times. I know you
That's
mentioned
right.
him
I
as
saw
well,
that.
right?
That's
Like,
great.
I love Toronto's ecosystem because it's full of people who truly want to see the region and people in it succeed. You know, the way I see innovation in startups is that, yeah, here are these things that's going to go out and potentially make a lot of money, but a lot of them fail. But even in that failure process, you're seeding a larger environment. It's like you're launching these ships, and even though some of them burn and crash, others make it, and you watch that. It inspires others to take off, and it just creates a cycle of everyone trying to create these things. And the point is, all this interaction, it just lifts humanity up. It lifts our society up. Everyone's pushing in different directions and getting us together. So when we have common resources like this, like Whitespace and Founders Institute and these kind of things, it really seeds like a larger framework. Our our selection pressure humanity has, our society gives towards how far up can we go up in building new things. So 100%.
I give Toronto very high marks on that because I'm from the U.S. originally, so I've talked to plenty of friends and entrepreneurs in bigger American cities, and the impression I got, I don't have proof, but this is what I've heard, is that they're much less likely to have the level of non-dilutive, no fee, no equity resources the way we have in the GTA. So I don't take that for granted. I've tried a couple of them, and they've created real value for me, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's actually really surprising, right? Like when you talk about U.S. accelerators and all these programs, this headline is like Y Combinator and all them, but they do take a stake in the company. They take equity. They want a piece, right? And yeah, it's one point, you feel like okay, you have supporters now that they have this, but again, you are giving out a piece of your idea, a piece of this, right? And there's things that are not appealing about that. So I do want to go back to a science question, and this one that really bugs me. I love what you're doing here, and I just want to tap in your mind state, right? This idea of like our biome and immunity, right? Like through like searching immunization projects like yourself and through learning about this kind of things, we're seeing a new framework for the human body, right? Like how it exists. How does this affect your daily life? Like how do you train on like principles of how to live when you know how immunization works and how your body works? Like how do you think and regulate your day?
Oh, that's a tough one. I guess I'll give kind of a dorky dad answer, which is, I'm raising a daughter. She's about 8.5. So to me, it's like almost all of my decisions are through the lens of, is this healthy for her? Is it enriching for her? And, nutritionally, emotionally, like cognitively stimulating, like through that. So with that as my lens, I actually find myself seeking out diversity of experience, like diversity of nutrition, meaning let's try different foods. I mean, she's loved sushi since she was about a year and a half, which is perfect because I love sushi too. So like I always have a sushi buddy. So there's the nutritional aspect. In terms of experiences, I just try to like expose her to enough diversity where she can form her opinions one day and like not do so many sports, but just like stick with what she loves. And she's actually like this like budding young soccer champ, so that's clearly a good fit for her. But we tried a bunch of everything else too. Like I have her out in the park running football routes. I have her running slants and diagonals, and I love that. I was
Yeah.
like, you don't get a snack until you make that catch. So, diversity of just athletics and of course scholastically, like, look, you got to pay attention to different topics and you have your schoolwork and I'll work with you as well. It can sometimes feel a little exhausting, but I think I've also just gravitated towards that natural rhythm of like, you don't have to overschedule everything. And not just her, but myself too. Like I've also, and maybe this is a better answer to your question, I have learned so much more in these past couple of years to listen to my own natural rhythms in terms of like sleep and like alcohol intake and working out, stuff like that. It's like, oh, maybe I planned to work out this evening, let's say. But then a friend I haven't talked to in a while calls and they're like, I'm just going to have a beer and like talk to this friend instead. I'm not going to beat myself up about the fact that I skipped this workout. I'll just do it the next day. I think there's a lot of rhythms that it makes sense to listen to. And you've come across all these like apps and tools that are like, sort of like micro schedule every part of your day. I don't think that works for me because it's just extra work to schedule and then like, well, what happens if you miss it? Are you supposed to like push it 15 minutes later? Are you supposed to cancel it? And then like, well, if you're going to cancel things, what was the point of scheduling it in the first place? So my attitude has been sort of like accept diversity and let that guide your life. And the most important things like nutrition and school and athletics, they'll probably get done. And some of the secondary things like, oh, I was supposed to make a new food today, or I was supposed to like, go to this specific place. If that didn't happen, okay, that's not a big deal. I think I've become a lot more zen as I've gotten a bit older that your life doesn't need to go according to plan because who set that plan in the first place? It's just an arbitrary list of stuff someone decided you're supposed to do. Who's this person that I'm supposed to listen to and do things in an exact way? Like, that person is me. I get to make the decisions.
I love that. Yeah. So I mean, speaking about this and especially as an entrepreneur, how does that reflect from what you previously used to do, right? Like now you're running the startup, you're running around learning different things, operating. You have family, you have you have a daughter that you're very involved with. how do you prioritize your time? Like, what are the shifts and changes that you're experiencing, especially now with COVID, everything's virtual, right? How are you
Yeah.
dealing with things?
Well, to the first part of your question, like how did this compare to previous, more traditional roles? I'll start with that one. And I think the coolest part is, obviously as a founder of your own company, you own all the mistakes. Like you're just kind of eating that. There's no
Yeah.
one else you can pin it on. But the things that seem promising or the things that worked really well, like you get to own that too, and I think that's great. And that's really different from some of the previous jobs I've had. I've gone through academia. I've had more corporate type roles. I've had several nonprofit roles in the Toronto sector, but nonprofits that were structured kind of like corporations with just lots of hierarchy and a lot of reporting requirements. And it's easy to see after a while that some of those activities they can feel a bit arbitrary, like checking the boxes. I had one role where we had to fill in, weekly reports, monthly reports, and then, semi-monthly reports. It just like felt like every time you finished a report, you were due for the next one. So after a while, it's like, how am I supposed to do actual work if I'm supposed to write reports about the work I was doing? But I wasn't really doing work because I kept writing the reports about the work I was supposed to be doing. It just felt like this weird circle, like being on a hamster wheel and never getting off. Whereas for now, and I've taken the same philosophy I just told you, which is like, I'm not going to really hyper segment and schedule every 15-minute chunk of my day because I'm going to decide in a given morning or a given hour, this is important and this could actually move our business forward. So let me just do this and let me kind of take all this other clutter and just push it to the side. Like if I'm writing a proposal for grants or responding to investors, that deserves my time. And maybe I had something scheduled, but I'm going to push that because this investor is really motivated. The faster I can respond, the faster we can close the deal. So I think agility has been really good for me. Like have a schedule, have a plan. That's always good, but be flexible as well. I mean, who's going to judge you for missing, a 15-minute increment of a scheduled block if it's your own company? I mean, like there's no one else there to judge you for that. If you
Mm-hmm.
felt that you made a decision to be more productive and more mission focused, then I think you did the right thing.
I love that. That's such a great point to end it on. Um, Raj, man, I really appreciate your time and taking this on. I've learned a lot through this conversation, and really appreciate you allowing me to like dive deep into like different aspects of this mentality of this movement that's going on right now. Really enjoyed learning more about you and your company. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Ravi. I had a great time with you. Appreciate it.
Perfect. Awesome. Stick around. We'll do a quick debrief, and for everyone else, thanks so much.